Shall we maybe wait, I don't know, 3-4 more minutes just so that people can join us and
Sure. You're the you're the boss, yeah. But so when you decide, you will give a sort of starting statement.
I'll start introducing you. Yes.
Slide back up. My slides?
I think the couple slides, yes, please.
Not sure what.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. I can see at least 1 or 2 names that scare me in the audience. Won't say who.
Right, shall we maybe get started? So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our third Libertinism seminar on the radical enlightenment. My name is Roger Schutt, as you can tell from the title. I'm a Libertinism early career fellow here at the University of Oxford and a fellow of St. Edmund Hall. And my research focuses primarily on the literature, philosophy, and culture of 18th century France. Today, I have the great honor of being here with Charles Wolfe, a world-leading expert on 18th century French materialism, or materialism more broadly, and history of biology. He is currently professor of philosophy at the Université de Toulouse II, and an associate member of several research institutions across Europe. Prior to joining the Université de Toulouse, he held various posts and fellowships at the Ca' Foscari in Venice, the University of Ghent, and the University of Sydney, among others, and then several visiting fellowships and professorships in Pittsburgh, Nagoya, and Budapest. He's published very insightful articles on La Métrie and Diderot, but also on Locke, Collins, and Descartes, and has also edited and co-edited a large number of special issues and collections of essays on vitalism and empiricism. He's also the author of 3 monographs: Materialism, a historico-philosophical introduction, which appeared for Springer in 2016, La philosophie de la biologie avant la biologie, published by Garnier in 2019, and last but not least, Lire le Materialisme, which brings together some of his best pieces on materialism. And today he's going to talk on the history of materialism and intelligent materialism. So thank you very much, Charles, for agreeing to give this lecture, and over to you.
Thank you, Roger. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to be invited. Thank you for the kind introduction, and I'm going back to share my slide. And it's showing me 2 minutes. It's a bit better. And let me put it in bigger view. So I was saying it's a pleasure to be here, and I do work on the history and philosophy of materialism. I have the largest ever edited volume project, co-edited volume project on this topic, which, as they say, watch this space or sometime in the coming year. Not sure if the book will be out in the coming year, but it will definitely be ready. And I think it's just called, I often have trouble with titles, and sometimes plain is good. I think that one is going to be called History and Philosophy of Materialism. And it's sort of big Routledge volume, not exactly a handbook, similar to a handbook. So at Ruggiero's invitation today, presenting something which is indeed not in my previous work, and some of which is a reflection on, and some of which is elements that are precisely missing there. And you can judge for yourself what extent all this is coherent or not. And these books were already mentioned, so now it's doubly embarrassing because it's repetition. But so these are really my two book version attempts at the topic, and they're different books. There's actually one chapter that's the same, but otherwise they're different. And part of what I want to do today, part of what interests me here, you might say is methodological, or at least has a slightly methodological flavor in reflecting on what it means to try and write about the history of materialism, how one does it, what the problems are, and so forth. And with apologies to some of the people present who know all these things very well, the history of the term itself is of interest. And you might say the history of all terms is of interest. Empiricism is an interesting and problematic term. Vitalism, which I've worked on, is an interesting and problematic term. Materialism has, as I think Olivier Bloch was probably the first to stress, has the funny peculiarity that it's first and largely used by its opponents. It's not just that the word is used by people who are hostile to the view, it's that they do a lot of brilliant work. And I didn't put Cudworth's name there, but someone like Cudworth is notorious for how much effort he puts into problems like, atheism, Hobbism, materialism, corporealism, as he says. In some ways, the anti-materialists of the 17th century do more work on systematizing, typologizing, defining, formalizing the concept than anyone else ever did. And so that's an interesting problem to itself. Sometimes when teaching, I think the analogy came to me very spontaneously. And as you all know very well, it can be humiliating when you use what you think is an obvious political or cultural analogy and the students are not familiar with it. And a few years ago, I was talking about this problem, and I spontaneously said, it's a bit like McCarthyism, and how one can imagine in the FBI, there were specialists of communism, and there were scholars, and they were trying to develop an expertise that would allow them to identify, this person is probably a Trotskyist, this person is some other variant of the doctrine that we are trying to hunt down. And the class that I was teaching, most of them didn't know what McCarthyism was, so it wasn't a great analogy. But the second sort of basic contextual point is that Lamétrie, the notorious doctor, philosopher, physician, philosopher of the mid-18th century, is the first thinker to self-identify, as we would say nowadays. Lamétrie was really not scared of anything, and he was not scared of any scandal. He provoked many. And so he embraced the term, and it was rare, in that sense, singular at the time, for him to embrace it. When we come to the question of what does it mean, what definition can we give? Is it possible to put some order into the historical mess, or complexity, multiplicity, or just mess of usages and definitions and semantic fields? Well, trying to see my slide a bit better. One one important point, which, well, again, Bloch wrote about this, but then Jonathan Israel's celebrated Radical Enlightenment book caused a lot of fuss on the topic because of slightly literal way he seemed to be taking Spinozism. And Moreau, in a piece that hasn't been noticed much, Pierre-François Moreau, has an interesting way of providing, I'm not a computer technician, but it's like a small fix, which makes Israel's historiographic narrative work slightly better. I see that I have a wrong apostrophe on Israel's, but it's not on purpose. So in the historical context, there is this sort of field of words that are used rather interchangeably, even though the historian of philosophy would say, well, Hobbes is not equal to Epicurus, and Locke is accused of being a materialist, but Locke's certainly no atheist, so why is atheism a synonym? We can, of course, pick apart this synonymy, but it forms some of the basso continuo, or it forms some of the kind of deep background to the debates on the term. A different way of addressing the question of what it means or how to handle possible, putting some order, it's not a very friendly phrase, but trying to create some kind of taxonomy or typology. Different way to do that, instead of just studying historical varieties of the term. And in parentheses, so an article that I partly disagreed with, but that made a very interesting attempt from 10, 15 years ago, article by Lolordo on Epicureanism and naturalism. She made the suggestion there that the category of naturalism was anachronistic, so we should just say Epicureanism because that was the real naturalism. She made some attempt to combine actors' categories and a philosophical decision on how to handle debates of the period. And that was an interesting case in between my two bullet points here. But so on the philosophical side, on the philosophical side, I've suggested in some other work, I've suggested a kind of broad conceptual distinction between what Georg Friedrich Meyer in the early 18th century. So I thought I came up with this distinction all by myself in a long paper for Routledge Companion to 18th Century Philosophy, edited by Aaron Garrett. And then a year or two after publishing that, I learned that Georg Friedrich Meyer in the early 18th century had distinguished between, in fact, three kinds. And I hope I put Falk Wunderlich's name there. I did. Falk Wunderlich's excellent introduction to his special issue that he edited of British Journal of the History of Philosophy on early modern materialism discusses all these typologies, whether mine or Meyer's. In any case, the useful distinction, the useful big distinction, was between so-called cosmological materialism, which is a thesis about the nature of the world itself, the nature of the universe. It's an explicit commitment as to what that nature is. Obviously, it's material. And then there are different versions of cosmological materialism with different, you might say, matter theories / scientific contexts that nourish or feed the content of that cosmological materialism. So the broad distinction would be between that kind of materialist claim and a much more narrow or much more specific psychocerebral or cerebral or brain-mind focused materialism. And in the 20th century, philosophers debating materialism very much turned to the second kind. And it's been a long time since I've read J.J.C. Smart's Britannica entry on materialism and related pieces that he wrote of that kind. But if I remember correctly, Smart says quite explicitly, people used to debate big questions about matter and so forth. Today, we professional philosophers are interested in brain and mind. And at this point, one can historicize Smart's claim itself and say, well, for a certain chunk of the 20th century, that became a very strong focus. And that focus on brains and minds, I shouldn't give the impression that it's unique to the 20th century. I have a paper on Diderot which suggests that he's perhaps the first materialist to see that the nature of the brain is going to be the real challenge, the real proof in the pudding for a successful materialism, in the way that someone like Hobbes has a thoroughgoing physicalistic scheme in which mental events and processes are small motions. But Hobbes doesn't particularly say, oh, I need to worry about what the brain is and its relation to who we are and so forth. So that's one very general distinction for thinking about materialism. And on that distinction, one could, well, complain or criticize and say, well, that leaves out all the moral business. And it's another interesting feature of this doctrine historically, that unlike idealism or unlike empiricism or unlike, perhaps less unlike skepticism, it has, at least for the first centuries of its official existence, and in a way for Greek antiquity as well, it has a sort of moral/immoral flavor. The problem doesn't seem to be free from certain moral questions. So it's true that the claim that everything is material, so a sort of crude version of the first kind of materialism, that claim seems to annoy/frighten/antagonize thinkers from certainly the Cambridge Platonists, certainly certain early 20th century humanists, and many others in between. And so there's an interesting example. I just like the sentence from Mauriac. It's not a very well-known text. I found this somewhere. Mauriac in the mid-20th century says, I'll translate, says, if everything is matter, I can't see in the name of what, in fact, we could condemn Stalin's work. By work, I assume he simply means Stalin, what Stalin did. So the general distinction, so this general distinction between two big kinds of materialism, leaves out this moral problem, which is only briefly going to be part of my story. And secondly, in my title, I have this mysterious phrase, which I've gotten interested in, intelligent materialism. And the two people whose portraits I put on my title slide both use the term intelligent materialism. I'm not sure that I fully understand what it means, but I've gotten interested in it. And one question I'll sort of ask in closing is, does that notion fit in this general category of mind? Is it a third notion? Is it a meta notion, etc.? Another important point that you might say necessarily should come up when thinking about cosmological materialism. It sounds almost trivially true to say this, but is it a metaphysics? And the simple question, is materialism a metaphysics, itself runs into some interesting difficulties, because you find La Mettrie, whose name was mentioned already, you find certain very representative materialists denying this, saying, oh, Spinoza, Leibniz, Descartes, those people write metaphysical systems. We don't. We're empiricists. In the case of La Mettrie, he can say, I'm a doctor, and my knowledge builds on a kind of more or less clinical, empirical body of knowledge. That's, of course, a rhetorical posture as much as anything else, but there's, let's say, tensions between someone like D'Holbach or Diderot in most of his moves, who are quite happy to provide a kind of foundational story, or to say that their job is to provide a foundational story. And those materialists who don't. And a figure that I won't speak about today and who I, someday might work on, but haven't worked on, Don Deschamps, who is a Benedictine friar, monk, who wrote this enormous metaphysical system in the mid-18th century. Deschamps, who is a materialist, Deschamps explicitly and in those terms says the materialists of our time have the weakness that they don't go all the way to a metaphysical system. So that's its own recurrent, that question of metaphysics is, you could think of it as, the piece of Scotch tape you can't get off a finger, or pick your image, but it's a recurrent issue in thinking about the biggest, most robust version of materialism. So I mentioned this always interesting fact that the doctrine originally is invented. Well, that's a problem right there. To say that the doctrine is invented by its opponents is a very strong claim. And that would be something like Alan Charles Corse's claim in his well-known book on atheism, the original volume, which is the sort of the major part of that work, where he says, and it's been criticized brilliantly by Paganini and others, Corse says atheism is an invention of apologetic doctrine. And that's methodologically a fascinating claim. It takes away some agency, as we would say today, from the thinkers we're interested in. And indeed, it may be too strong a claim. It may be slightly wrong, dare I say. Another methodological point I might make is that the variety of kinds of materialism, which I list some there, but I've made some efforts in other places to try and typologize and show this variety. So the point we can make here is that this variety itself can be used philosophically to challenge a certain number of philosophical judgments, on materialism. So I just put a classic example. It's been a slightly different version, has been literally shouted at me at the end. I don't think it was during my lecture, but at the end of a lecture I gave University of Kansas some years ago, professor, I believe a retired professor there, shouted, materialism will never explain the categorical imperative, which had not been the topic of my talk anyway, but that's just my own personal, my own little bit of experience. There are many, many versions of these. Materialism can't explain or destroys in its attempt to explain X, Y, or Z. And for every version of materialism that might apply to, there'll be another one it might not apply to. This business, this sort of polemos or oppositional context of the emergence of the doctrine means that there is, of course, quite a strong polarization. And excuse me. The early example of that kind of polarization, which Bloch in his short introduction to materialism mentions, is, I think it's in the Sophist, is the presentation of a tension between the lovers of the forms and the sons of the earth. And the sons of the earth are sort of early version of crude reductive materialists, and the lovers of the forms are the defenders or tenets of the proper doctrine. This polarization, I mentioned the moral flavor. Here's an example. I'm simply mentioning this because it's interesting that in one of the earliest English usage, so the first appearances in French are slightly different, and in Latin, and I think in German later. And I can't quote from memory. I can't remember concretely if when Christian Wolfe uses the term, I think it's in Latin when he uses it, not in German. Anyway, in one of the earliest English uses, Henry Moore has explicitly puts the problem in moral terms, where he he describes, or character in the dialogues describes, the materialist character as well, not, again, not of the bad kind, sort of full reductive, someone post-19th century might say mechanistic materialist, and that this particular individual is as great a moralist as he is a materialist of a kind and friendly nature. And I'm not focusing in this talk on La Métrie, but this would be a perfect way to sort of unpack, by contrast, what La Métrie does. La Métrie literally writes things like what he says, the true philosopher is a materialist, but he also says the true philosopher is a bad citizen and that kind of thing. So La Métrie, you might say, bites the bullet that much of the anti-materialists have created. So methodology again. What do we do? How do we do the history of this object? And this is simply, it's not a random sample, but it's a partial sample where Lange's book is almost literally the only such work. There's by now one other work in French that I don't find fully, satisfactory, but they're very rare. It's rare to attempt this kind of book. And Armstrong's book from technically 1966. I actually wonder if that's true. I think it's slightly later, 1968, I think. Armstrong's book is a major intervention in the second kind, materialism, if you remember my distinction earlier. And I put Le Machine as the sort of perfect in between, in a sense. Now, Lange's book, as people who've actually read it will have noticed, this is no secret, but it's not known when people casually refer to Lange's history of materialism. It's actually an attempt at destroying the doctrine. It's, I was joking earlier about McCarthyism and whatnot. Well, Lange is is in his own way, he's a careful scholar, he's interested in what he's writing about, he's not zealous, but to some extent, this massive multi-volume work is an attempt to show all the possible versions and internal contradictions and failures of a doctrine so that Kantian philosophy emerges as the solution. It's what we often think of Hegel and of Hegelianism as doing, of sort of creating a full narrative where there's Spinoza and there's Aristotle and there are many others, all of which have some good elements, but all those good elements turn out to be in Hegel and the bad elements are discarded. Lange does this with Kant as well, here. And as I mentioned, if one wants sort of further reflection on this specific methodological level of the issue, see the special issue that Falk Winderlich edited, and dare I say, I did a longish discussion with Pierre-François Moreau on this topic. It was meant to be about the book that I had done, but it's a sort of a sustained methodological reflection. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's this problem of whether the ism that we're dealing with is a metaphysical claim or not. And the other day in searching for something, I found this quote from, I think he's actually a psychologist. I'm not quite sure what this is from Alfred Binet. It's a clever or amusing quote, but it's wrong. And instead of just saying it's wrong, I suppose I could contextualize and say 19th century discussions of this issue, of which Binet is one, often have a positivist flavor, a Kantian positivist flavor. And so you'll find texts saying materialism today is no longer a metaphysics because it is experimentally based. And in this case, he's perhaps being sarcastic because he's viewing them as some of the polemical materialists of that time did, as people who said they're beyond metaphysics or post-metaphysics or very scientific, fully scientific. And on either side, I think they're misguided because it's saturated with metaphysics. And one way that I've been interested in playing out some of those we might call metaphysical differences is the distinction between vital and mechanistic materialism. And a quote perhaps familiar to some people, which I've discussed before, but seemed to me, needed to be put here again. Engels, who, to be fair, says other things as well, but in this passage, Engels gets various things, you might almost say the wrong way around. I quote, "For the materialists of the 18th century, man was a machine." So when we see that, what can he be thinking of? Well, there's a famous book from the mid-18th century called L'Homme Machine, Man and Machine. Except that it turns out, if we bother to read his book, that there's not a single sentence in it which reduces organic or organismic properties to basic mechanistic properties, whether in the sense of a kind of classical mechanistic ontology or in the sense of properties of machines, something that Denis Deschênes wrote beautifully on the relation between those two kinds of mechanism. The chemistry business in Engels' quote is also very misguided because he probably feels like the 19th century is when chemistry is born. And that might be true from a certain kind of presentist or, forward-looking philosophy of science or history of science. But it's a fact about mid to late 18th century chemistry in France in general and French materialist interest in chemistry in that period, that so-called chemistry and the chemistry of life in particular is what's that word in English? Obsessively present. It's present in an obsessive way. The relation between Diderot's matter theory and his interests in chemistry is it's like rice and beans. They're deeply embedded and mutually nourishing discourses, just as an example. Now, it's not just Engels. As I put below that, it's a kind of commonplace that the materialist treats us and treats our living bodily reality as if we were machines. And just as one example, in one short sentence, Diderot in this late work, which is arguably unfinished, some people think it's, there's some debate as to what the status he intended for this work is, but it's certainly a very interesting series of chunks of long fragments of text. So Diderot writes, "What a difference there is between a sensing living watch and a golden iron, silver, or copper watch." And of course, what he means there is what a difference between an organism, as we might say, and the machine. So what a difference between a watch possessed of properties like a nervous system and life, and we might say that that's an organism, and sort of ordinary mechanical device. And so, of course, we could say to Diderot, well, what is the difference? Is it an empirical difference? Is it a metaphysical difference? And he is slippery. He doesn't always fully commit on that question. But that quote is at least indicative that he cares about the difference. When I say that it's not just Engels, there is an entry in a very prominent and useful and used reference source in English, the Oxford Companion to the History of Modern Science, has an entry, Materialism and Vitalism, which states, well, it's what's right there, materialists make the ultimate principles matter and motion, vitalists the soul or an irreducible life force. And I wouldn't want my modest intellectual career to be reduced to a reaction to both halves of the sentence, but it's true that With regards to materialism, it seems to me, and it would certainly seem to, let's say, Lametrie or Diderot, that definition doesn't, it's not that it doesn't hold, it's much too limited, because a certain number of people from at least Toland onwards, and then on to people like Diderot, are adding many more basic principles to matter. That's one thing, and I'll talk about that in the time I have left. And the same for vitalists, which is not my topic today, but then there are plenty of self-described important vitalists of the 18th century who go out of their way explicitly to say the soul is not the source of vital animation, which is Stahl's thesis. And they say, well, I actually don't want to explain what's vitalistically specific in terms of an irreducible life force. That's a different story. So Engels or Wellman or many others, when they have this view, what's implicit, as I put at the bottom there, is a conception of matter as passive. So this business about mechanistic often is interchangeable in a sense with an idea of passivity. And passivity, at least in the 17th century, is often described as stupidity, which is to say, you find a language of stupid matter. And here's Cudworth, who is complaining about the idea that, well, it's a version of the claim I've mentioned earlier. If everything was material, how could there be X? Or if everything was material, it would be very bad because, dark, womb, unthinking matter, and stupid and senseless matter. And the language of stupid or stupidity is not just in Cudworth. There's a number of, for example, there's a number of Boyle lectures. I don't think it's in Bentley's Boyle lecture, but there's a number of the Boyle lectures in the late 17th, early 18th century that attack the sort of idea of stupid matter. And perhaps, since, as we presumably all know here, there is a kind of Newtonian thrust in the Boyle lectures, perhaps they think that they both have an enhanced idea of matter and they have a certain version of a physico-theology of a design universe. So they feel emboldened to talk about the stupidity of matter, but that's an aside. So faced with this very widespread, and you might say intuitively appealing idea that, matter is dark and stupid, and life and thought and sensation and morals can't be found in this stupid, inert, passive matter. Faced with that widespread intuition, it's not exactly an argument, is it? It's something more like an intuition. Well, I'll mention two major responses that I view as somehow perfectly cumulative, kind of like layers in a millefeuille or something like that. And the quote that I have there in the middle is just another instance of the either if everything is material, here's what's lost, or in the case of Imita Hill's article, it's a slightly different way of putting the problem, because she essentially says, oh, materialism is fine when used instrumentally, technologically, scientifically, because there's something about the material universe that can be explained by materialism. But once we turn to, the inner life, human nature, human thought, human emotions, yields disastrous results. I haven't used that quote in a long time, and it's funny when, I don't mean humorous, but it's peculiar that those kinds of supernormative judgments are sitting in scholarly papers. Because I mentioned it's a paper on Diderot. It's not a piece of metaphysics by Imita Hill. It's scholarship on Diderot in which she's attacking what she thinks are the limitations of materialism. So two major responses to the mechanistic, blind, cold, dark, stupidity matter. I'll mention two such responses. One is John Toland's, fascinating figure. I don't know enough about his life or his non-philosophical work because each time I've read a few of his books, it turns out there's more of the, especially of the less philosophical kind. But the fifth letter is entitled Motion Essential to Matter. And I won't read all these quotes. I've extracted from Toland a series of, they're sort of variations on the general theme that activity is part of the definition of matter. Matter is but motion. And if you go further down, so the ceaseless process or constant process of destroying and begetting, but matter neither ever was nor ever can be a sluggish, dead, and inactive lump in state of absolute repose, etc. So that's, you might say, that's motion that's being put as a basic property. That's a certain kind of inner activity or internal dynamism that's being posited, or rather that's being attributed to matter itself. In a relatively late text by Diderot, which is a kind of a piece of philosophy of nature, or perhaps a piece, as we might say today, of philosophy of science, very focused on physics and chemistry, in this short work, The Philosophical Principles, Matter and Motion, well, there's a sense in which the passage I extract follows, I would say, rather neatly from what Toland is saying, in the sense that it's a statement that matter itself has this kind of innate heterogeneity, activity, dynamism, etc. That's not explicitly life, although it turns out that when asked what life is, these kinds of descriptions will come up as well. Again, the idea that the living system, the living body, the embodied, the state of embodiment isn't reducible to a sort of simple machine. All those descriptions are playing a role there. I put this illustration because it's a classic one, and it's always interesting to look at it. I don't want to create a malentendu. The illustration is from a very different work. It's from Descartes' Treatise on Man. But the interesting thing there is that Descartes is seeking to provide a mechanistic account of the nervous system, but in some sense is putting his finger on the fact that a lot more work is going to be needed to do justice to the nervous system. And Diderot's metaphor, as I mentioned at the bottom there, metaphor of the harpsichord, which is a very elegant metaphor he uses in D'Alembert's Dream, is precisely one step of complexity beyond the boy in Descartes' diagram, which is to say, the harpsichord with its vibrating strings is something a little bit past the ordinary machine. And I think Jamie Kastler, in her work since the 80s, has written a lot of pieces that really do a beautiful job of showing the shift from kind of classical mechanistic accounts to vibratory accounts, in her case. So I've discussed so far these two major forms of materialism. I've actually really discussed certain variations on the first more broad, more general kind, because I haven't addressed in this talk the brain-mind kind of materialism. And so-called cosmological materialism allows of different ontologies. I skipped over vital, but what I was starting to say before is that in this move from a kind of, let's say, pure physicalism or pure atomism to an increasingly dynamic vision of what matter is, at a certain point that will also become, you could view it either way. You could say life as well gets built in to the basic properties of matter, or you could say that in this kind of physico-chemical ferment, something like self-organization, not a notion I find particularly helpful or useful, but it's a popular one. So you could say something like self-organization starts to be itself built into those concepts. And so, life, you might say, just pops out at that point. what about, and this is my last section, as it were, what about so-called intelligent materialism? Where does it fit in all this? Intelligent materialism, if we were just asked to quickly, write an exam of one page on the term, we could come up with all kinds of associations, like panpsychism. Instead, you'd say that intelligent materialism is itself, it's 20th century coinage, as far as I can tell. But it's a reaction to the idea that matter is stupid, and in that sense, materialism is stupid. And it wants to build intelligence into materialism itself. And as a reminder, for those of you who were not exposed to either Hegelo-Marxism or variants thereof, there's this great quote from Lucio Coletti, which I think he's channeling Hegel, in fact, when he says this, but all true philosophies are idealism. Materialism is une philosophie, anti-philosophy. And Hegel says things like that about idealism in several places. And it's a popular view that great philosophy is going to be a version of idealism, and that materialism, while it might have its merits, is somehow, inferior, crude, reductive, perhaps kind of a scientific ideology, et cetera, et cetera. So what happens when people put forth or invoke an intelligent materialism? Well, you get two instances. You get Lenin in these notebooks on, in this case, on Hegel's history of philosophy, not the better known notebooks on Hegel's logic. It's these two somewhat sibylline sentences. Intelligent idealism is closer to intelligent materialism, stupid materialism, dialectical idealism instead of intelligent, metaphysical, undeveloped, dead, crude, rigid instead of stupid. That word dead looks strange there, but I'm pretty sure I copied it down right. Well, what's going on here? I assume, I'm not a Leninologist, but I assume that the idea that there is an intelligent version of materialism is him building on a Marxist idea that the better kind of materialism is one that focuses on activity, on practice, on transformation. And you see, even in a very well-known text, like first thesis on Feuerbach, you see this focus on the fact that there's a sort of lesser materialism, maybe worthy in its own way, but limited, and a better kind, which has this sort of activity concept, which will have to be integrated, as it were. One could say more, and I don't really want to pretend, again, to be a Lenin scholar, but I think the intelligent materialism versus crude or stupid materialism in Lenin is something like merely mechanistic is stupid, and a materialism plugged into, activity, but then you might say, what's activity? Is it a magic word? And one would have to unpack that and say, the historico-social, practical locus or matrix of human beings in the way that they transform the world. That's probably where that kind of intelligent materialism wants to go. Deleuze, in his Spinoza book, uses something that I noticed at some point, uses basically the same phrase, and I put the quote here, because he too makes a distinction. He says, Plato says, I'm not sure where Plato ever says anything like this. Someone finds a passage in Plato that matches this, you can find me. Deleuze, in a sense, makes up this idea that there's a stupid kind which reduces everything to body or bodies, and indeed that's a well-known kind of materialism. Everything is body. Then the question there is, what's body? And when Hobbes says that, it doesn't mean quite the same thing as when a vital materialist says that, in the next century. But Deleuze seems to think that the intelligent materialist builds what he calls power, which is to say dynamis, I guess, which is to say a kind of potentiality, a dynamism into matter. And then just to return the favor, he says it's also true that intelligent dynamists must also think of bodies, not just be theorists of power. I've tried to show some possible use of, and you know, I might be, it's worse than preaching to the converted. If I were speaking in a seminar of very internalist philosophers, then you could imagine I would want to, and my challenge would be to convince people of the importance of a certain degree of historicism or contextualism. You might say, well, in a radical enlightenment seminar, most people here presumably are active contextualists or accept it as a matter of fact. But then I would say, well, what's the philosophical payback of that kind of contextualism? And as I mentioned at the beginning, and I hope you can see more concretely now what I meant, some of that typology or typologizing should be useful in kind of taking apart either some of the tensions or some of the standard anti-materialist judgments. As to this form that I kind of turn to at the end, what do we do with it? Because it's difficult, as I say, it's difficult to just historicize it. It doesn't seem to fall neatly into one of my categories. One could also, as a specialist of materialism, let's say, one could say, oh, Lenin and Toulouse are using the word, but it's really just a word, materialism. They're really doing something else. You know, maybe they are idealists in materialist clothing. That's possible. Is intelligent materialism, this is a third possibility, is it to be compared to the way that in Diderot, materialism becomes very much a vital materialism, which is to say, interested in a higher level, as some people might have it, rather than in basic physics? I leave that. I leave that for discussion, because we very much have used up our time. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles, for this wonderful paper. So the floor is now open for questions, and so you can either raise your hand or you can type your question in the chat box, and I can read it for you.
Should I start my presentation or should I leave it there?
I'd say let's just leave it there, just in case someone wants to go back to any of your quotes. So I can see a hand, but it's been there for a while. I don't know if that's Maria. Would you like to ask a question? If not, I can...
That hand was there.
Yeah, that
beginning.
That's been there for a while, right? So, well, in that case, I'll just break the ice. So I was just wondering about that quote that you have from Engels about the fact that 18th century materialism was mechanistic. And of course, if you look at he probably has La Métrie in mind, and the title of the machine. But then, of course, if you read the texts, if you read La Métrie or Diderot, of course, you don't find mechanism anywhere there. So my question was there a kind of mechanistic materialism in the 18th century? Was that kind of, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I remember delivering a paper to a materialism conference at Rice University that John Zamito and Sarah Ellensweig put together, in which they did a volume out of. And I remember Zamito saying to me, maybe I was giving the mistaken impression that there was no mechanistic materialism. And of course, that's indeed true. One shouldn't give that impression. You asked if there's some in the 18th century. I might start answering by saying, well, someone like Hobbes is perhaps the best instance thereof. And some Hobbes scholars quibble and they find parts of what we might call his philosophy of mind that are not strictly mechanistic, like curiosity. And that's fine, but the general lines that he explicitly lays out definitely match that description. Once we move into the 18th century, it's indeed a tricky question because Priestley was an interesting materialist of the later 18th century. Priestley, if we call him a mechanist, then it has to be a very expanded and enhanced and complexified mechanism with, in fact, a lot of chemistry, with a lot of Newtonianism, with a lot of, dozens of things built into what mechanism means, such that most usages of the term mechanistic materialism don't mean that. D'Holbach, who I think you know better than I do, D'Holbach seems to use that language often. There's only one kind of cause, physical causes, and then, the focus on motion and matter seems to be quite present in D'Holbach. I'm a little cautious in saying, let's just use the label for him, because I suspect he does a bit more than that, A. B, there's the mysterious fact, I can see D. Garber raising his hand. There's the mysterious fact that Diderot is meant to have written some of the Système de la Nature. So what do we do with that? But D'Holbach, if this were just, giving some rough idea, Hobbes, D'Holbach, and Priestley would be three major materialists I can think of that more or less fit. And then you might need type A, type B, type C or something, but that more or less fit that label.
Thank you. Yeah, so I can see that Daniel Garber would like to ask a question. Should I?
Yes, I'm happy to ask my own question. Charles?
Yep. Hi, Dan.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes,
yep.
Yes, we can.
Good. I would like to, when you're talking about intelligent materialism and historicizing it, I guess I was just a little bit puzzled what you meant by talking about the difficulty of that. There's one case, and this goes back earlier than the Enlightenment. Do you want to call her a major figure or not? Margaret Cavendish, who I would think of as a wonderful example of the sort of thing that you have in mind by intelligent materialism, writing in the 1660s, using exactly the language of Hobbes. She writes, for example, nature is purely corporeal or material. There is nothing in it that belongs to or is part of nature which is not corporeal. So that natural and material or corporeal are one and the same, et cetera, et cetera. And it looks, in fact, like a paraphrase of Hobbes. But of course, she thinks that there are animate and inanimate varieties of matter. And of the animate varieties, there are sensitive and rational varieties of matter, which she insists are all different kinds of matter. Isn't that a kind of, where do you put her?
Yeah.
She doesn't, and it's not clear that any of her contemporaries really quite picked up on this. Although it seems to me, a strand that you can trace back to, for example, Bacon, and before Bacon, to some of the late 16th century Italians, that you can trace into Leibniz, for example, who, on the one hand, can certainly be read as an idealist, but also insisted that everything can be explained entirely materialistically. And all of these people thought that matter by itself was, in some sense or another, perceptive. Where do you put those in your categorization?
Yeah, well, thank you, Dan. And that's, well, of course, on the one hand, it's a hard question. And on the other hand, it shouldn't be, because of course I've been interested in some of those people. So I should either have a place or be aware of why it's a problem to place them. So what can I say? Number one, Cavendish on these questions is always a bit frustrating for me, because her philosophy of nature is easier for me to follow. Her metaphysics, I have sometimes trouble knowing what the final word is, because she says different things. And indeed, then the question might be, what is the higher level property that's built into matter by Cavendish? Is it life? Is it sensation? Is it thought? Because those things matter in the sense you're right. There is this kind of, Telesio, etc., tradition, if we want to call it a tradition. And Pietro Amodeo in Venice, when we did he very kindly hosted a session on my book, he was talking a lot about Telesio and those kinds of authors as
Telesio is the background.
form.
Telesio is the background to Bacon, for example, on exactly that, who also insists that everything is matter, but on the other hand also insists that everything is perceptive, and sees a certain kind of rationality in matter as well.
Well, okay, two quick things. One is that tradition, again, tradition with quotes, effectively fits somewhere in between, even though historically it starts earlier, but let's say analytically it fits somewhere in between adding motion as a property of matter and life. So the focus on sensation is, one might say, a step that complexifies, motionalism, or a dynamic motionalist matter theory. And it starts to be in Telesio perhaps, in Bacon perhaps, because life per se isn't really the issue for them, but it starts to resemble what by perhaps one or two generations after them starts to be the concern for where is life in one's ontology. And that brings me to my second little point, which is that a lot of my story has something post-Cartesian about it. And this is my way of saying I'm not quite sure what to do with Cavendish, because there's a sense in which all this gradual complexification of materialism, there's a sense in which it's not post-Cartesian to rule out Gassendi and Hobbes, but reactions to something like Cartesianism. And it's not that all of the flowering of materialism is to be reduced to a reaction to Descartes, because then we would say, well, La Métrie mainly thinks of himself as an Epicurean, for example, and builds something into matter as an Epicurean. But there's a sense in which this narrative of complexification is a bit post-Cartesian. So I've written down for myself to think long and hard about what to do with Cavendish and that tradition. And, she gets called all kinds of things. Deborah Boyle, in the recent book on her, calls her a vitalist, calls her a materialist in the same page. I assume someone has called her a panpsychist, because it also seems like one could view that as panpsychism. And so there's a point in which one says, okay, but then I'm not in a recognizable materialist landscape anymore. I'm in a landscape where someone's speaking about matter, but just producing lots of extra things under the name of matter. But I acknowledge that I need to find a place for or a story about those people. So thanks, Dan.
Thanks. I think there might be another question by Cameron. Cameron, would you like to I'll just bring it in? Thank you.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Fine. Well, thank you so much, Professor Wolfe, for a really, really fascinating paper. And thanks, Ruggiero, also for organizing this. There are so many questions I could ask, but I suppose I'll ask one that might help me practically, because I'm working on my thesis right now on, in fact, Deschamps. So thanks for the mention of him, and I look forward to reading your work on him. But also Morelli and Jean Méliès. And I was really struck by one of the titles of your slides, Writing the History of an Unmentionable Doctrine, which is absolutely just the thing that I've been wrestling with in a pretty historicist French faculty here, which is that my three authors, in addition to having sort of heterodox views, two of them are atheists at the very least, but then they're also anti-private property and everything. And so I suppose my question really is, how do you write the history of an unmentionable doctrine, and how do you square the circle of these texts that we have, which kind of go very much against the grain of the culture in which they're being produced, but at the same time we do have the texts, and they weren't read at the time. They were very much kept quiet, or indeed in Méliès's case not found until he died. So I guess I wondered, from a methodological perspective, whether you could talk a bit more about this challenge of writing the history of a doctrine, if we're going to say it's a doctrine at all in the first place, that was kind of in the shadows of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's the other way around. It's me who will be happy to read, your work on Deschamps when that comes out, because I'd like to someday do something perhaps synthetic with some Deschamps. So let me say one or two quick things. Hold on. Sorry. Let me say that this business about unmentionable, or about a doctrine that exists in some kind of conceptual space that doesn't necessarily match people, writing books in favor of it. Well, it's not just the names you mentioned. What we have, and Morelli I haven't read, but Deschamps and Méliès, of course, I have. We have materials to treat. Then there's, I guess it's Deschamps, where there's that story that Diderot meets him and writes about it, but sort of chuckles and says, it's a bit elitist of Diderot. Says, I've met this sort of rural intellectual who has a big system. How interesting. And, he probably thinks he's a bit mad in this like massive metaphysical materialist system. And then of course the impact is close to zero. And so that's its own possible problem. But when I was talking about the methodological issues before, I was thinking of something slightly different, which is And it's something that Pierre-François Moreau has been interested in, including when writing on the clandestine tradition, which is an overlapping, it's an overlapping category.
Yeah.
It's things like, how do we reflect on Locke as a part of the history of materialism? How do we reflect on Spinoza as a part of the history of materialism? And perhaps in a different way, Dan was mentioning Leibniz, possibly Leibniz too, which is to say, easily in the case of Locke and Spinoza, authors who shouldn't be subsumed under that category, but have either a part of their work that is like a tremendous conceptual booster or boost to a possible materialism, and or a reception of their work, which is itself in its kind of, remember the German term Wirkungsgeschichte, in its kind of outfolding, is a legitimate part of the history of materialism. And so that's something that the internalist, sort of analytic style historian of philosophy definitely has to grapple with, because that's not part of the rules of the game in that style of history of philosophy. You'd have, Descartes versus Spinoza, or, Locke versus, Kant versus Hume or Locke, and they're versus. It would be very tricky to say, let's take the possibility of thinking matter in Locke and ask whether, what does he mean by even introducing it as a possibility? And so Nicholas Jolly, in several publications, said, it's not neutral that Locke even introduces it, even though it's purely a conceptual possibility. It's actually not neutral. So, there are interesting issues like that. I'll just mention those. But the authors you talk about raise a different question. So it's me not answering you with another question, but saying that I applaud working on them, and what they pose as a problem to me is a different one. It's very straightforward. They pose the problem of the relation between materialist ontology and politics, because the moral business, which I've evoked today, is quite familiar, and we know that there's this reputation of immoralism, sometimes embraced, et cetera, et cetera. The politics is a bit of a tricky business, because naively we would think, this doctrine puts us on a boulevard to the French Revolution, but it turns out that doesn't really work that way. Rousseau is a staunch anti-materialist. Robespierre, perhaps because of Rousseau, is also a staunch anti-materialist. La Métrie, other way around, a staunch, radical, ontological materialist, is politically something like an elitist. So, as Anne Thompson pointed out long ago. So it does seem philosophically that a doctrine that all is matter should imply that social and political hierarchies and the divine right of kings and things like that should turn out to be false, just directly falsified, deflated, reduced, or whatever. And while that seems philosophically true and robust, it doesn't always play out that way historically. And I think the authors you mentioned, I guess especially Méliès, I think, are some of the rare ones who take on that mission, who say, the communism, using the word loosely and obviously in quotes, but the sort of communism of matter implies some sort of communism in the political sense of the word. And I find that very fascinating, and it's frustrating that it's a rare position, because it seems like such an obvious card. It's not just a card for the materialist to play, but it seems like such an obvious implication of materialist ontology. And sorry, it's a long answer, and sorry, Ruggiero, but when Marx and those people start to appropriate historiography of 18th century materialism for their own devices, they don't address this problem at all. They just say these people were radicals and brave and courageous, but they were a bit naive, or they were too mechanistic, as Engels says, or they hadn't addressed social and political concerns. They don't address the question of whether or not core materialist ontology does or doesn't have those political implications.
Thank you very much.
Could I just ask you a follow-up question? So you did mention Locke, and I was wondering, yeah, so where does the kind of essay kind of fit in this discussion? So could the kind of theory of thinking matter, for example, be taken as some sort of response to Cudworth, and the idea of the again, the stupidity of matter? And
I don't know, and I've until a few years ago, I had read a fair amount of the ongoing scholarship on that. I do say a fair amount because not all, and I don't work full-time on Locke, of course, but so I have never seen someone, I might be missing something, of course, but I've never seen someone come up with a real convincing story as to where the thinking matter hypothesis comes from. You know, when you look at those passages, I'm trying to remember them, but when Locke, you know, talks about super addition, and I think primarily, and Priestley does this in a fascinating way, well, you know, 70 years, 75 years after Locke's death. Both Locke and differently Priestley target Cartesianism as, and here's where the religious context and the religious content of their thought actually plays such a real role. Both Locke and Priestley, and not Collins, who's sort of the in-between figure for Locke and Priestley, both Locke and Priestley target Cartesian or Descartes and say Cartesian substance dualism should not be allowed to have a monopoly on Christian doctrine, which is to say, many people think of a radical substance dualism as somehow the kind of refined philosophical version of proper Christian doctrine. And Locke, and very explicitly Priestley, well, they want to prize apart those metaphysical claims from an authentic Christianity. And in the case of Priestley, it's literally explicit. He wants people to be able to accept or allow for a Christian materialism. And, you know, he says, once we get rid of Catholic superstition and the metaphysical accretions that Descartes has somehow added to this credo, if we somehow go back to a more minimal Christian credo, the fact that, you know, and you can think of mortalism here too, the fact that the body is material is true and it dies, but at the day of last judgment, just sort of stipulate that at the day of last judgment, you know, we get judged anyway, we're reborn or not, but we're judged anyway. And Locke is saying that God could perfectly well, you know, nothing limits God's capacity to add the power of thinking to matter. There's a sense in which he's doing exactly that. He's saying, let's not be intimidated by Cartesian metaphysics in our practice of being Christians, which raises a further question, just like I answered Cameron by saying, well, the politics is actually very crucial as an issue there. Well, here, the religion / the theology is really crucial because one could say that part of Locke's goal is not allowing for the success of materialism, although it's possible he doesn't mind, and his letters between him and Collins possibly indicate that he doesn't mind. Whereas he doesn't like the idea of Toland. And I've never quite understood why, but possibly because of Toland's behavior. Possibly it's just a social thing. Toland is a bit of a marginal and is a bit of a wild man. Therefore, his version of materialism is a bit distasteful to Locke, whereas what Collins does is not. In any case, rather than wanting to proclaim materialism, one could also say, well, Locke you can see in those late writings too, is trying to put a brick or, put a piece in the edifice of a kind of radical Christianity. But then, I'm the one who's saying, what do these things mean for the history of materialism? And there's the sort of minimal safe answer, which is a bit too safe, which is to say, Locke on thinking matter, like Malebranche on animal spirits and brain, or like various pieces of Leibniz, can be used. If we say we don't care that those authors also say, I am committed to blah, 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 which prevents me from being a materialist. If we don't care about certain further commitments of those authors, then we can take out those pieces and say, this is a beautiful, innovative piece of materialism. But that suspends the question of what they really want to be doing, which of course I think is important or interesting.
Right. Thank you very much, Charles, for this wonderful lecture, and for anyone who joined in the discussion, and for anyone who attended this event. And I would also like to thank Nikki and all the wonderful staff at Torch for making this event possible. So yeah, thank you very much again, Charles, and good night, everyone.
Thanks, Ruggiero. Thanks to Dan and Cameron for their nice questions, and I appreciate the opportunity to thrust out these dusty pieces. So many thanks, and talk soon.
Thank you very much.